Hello and welcome to the Ponsonby and Massey podcast. Now, today we're going to be taking a look at the electoral prospects of the SNP and more broadly what the result may well mean for the party's cherished goal of Scottish independence going forward. And we'll look at this within the context of the broader independence movement, because it's not just the SNP that we have to consider here. Now, we will also be doing this with the benefit of a guest, a veteran nationalist. More on that in a minute. But as we go into the election, as we wait the polling day on the 4th of July, the big question is whether or not the SNP will emerge as the largest party. Some polls suggesting that they will, some polls suggesting that they won't. John Swinney during the week saying majority of seats, that will do as a mandate to negotiate independence. Alex, I suppose the question is, will indeed they get a majority of seats?
I think, if we look at all the data we have available to us, if we look at how people are talking about the SNP, about the election more broadly, I think you have to concede that there is still a chance that the SNP can be the largest party at the Scottish end of the election. But by no means is it certain that they will. And in fact, I think most polling suggests that Labour are more likely to be the largest party in the Scottish portion of the election than not. But that's with the caveat that across more than a dozen, maybe even as many as 20 or so constituencies in Scotland, the margins between success and defeat are precious thin at present. There's a series of coin tosses going on across the Scottish electoral battleground, and it would be, it seems unlikely that they will, that all these coins will land heads for Labour or all tails for the SNP. I would suggest, though, that the SNP's approach to this is interesting. It's a consequence of the sort of poisoned legacy that Nicola Sturgeon bequeathed to the nationalist movement more generally. When she first raised the prospect of treating this election as a de facto referendum, I think she helped create circumstances in which this was going to be an extraordinarily difficult election for the SNP, even without the taking into consideration the impact of external events, because she set the bar for success impossibly high. The SNP would have to win more than 50% of the votes cast in Scotland at the election, and that would then be considered a mandate. Having floated that idea, they've now realised that, that would allow everyone else to turn around and say, you've had your second referendum and you've lost it, so jog on for another 20 years. And so they've then sort of said, they've defined the mandate downwards. It's increasingly a lower and lower hurdle that the SNP have declared themselves as the yardstick for success. But you don't get to determine what success is. The meaning of the election result is not the property of one political party, particularly a political party that isn't going to be going into government, it seems to be. And, there is absolutely no reason for a UK Prime Minister to see an SNP party that has lost at least 15 seats, say, in this election, and say, you've come out with a whopping great mandate for your constitutional preferences. That's just not going to happen. And so then the question, I suppose, becomes, what do the SNP do in response to that? And it doesn't strike me as obvious that there is a groundswell of national agitation for reopening the constitutional question right now. That's not to say it can't happen at some point in the future, but right now, I don't think it's a box that people want to reopen. And so that makes it very easy for Keir Starmer, if we assume that he's going to be Prime Minister, to say to John Swinney and the SNP, regardless of what the SNP's election result is, that, my offer to you is the same as that Michael Corleone offers to his opponents in The Godfather. My offer is this: nothing.
I think the result is important, and I think being the largest party is important. I would agree with the general view that even if the SNP emerges the largest party, if they're way down, and they would be way down from the current haul of 48 seats, and their percentage share is way down, however you define it, however you dice it up, saying that you have lost a lot of seats and lost a lot of votes, that your percentage share is well down, that you still have a mandate, that simply is not going to play. If, however, they do emerge with a percentage share of the vote slightly ahead of Labour and with slightly more seats than Labour, I think they can legitimately claim that they have won the election, albeit that they have actually gone back the way. That's important because this will have been an election which will not have been fought through the prism of the constitutional question. And when the constitutional question goes off the boil, that tends to be bad for the SNP. But it is important, I think, psychologically, from the point of view of the Scottish Government, although it's not a new government. In a sense, it is because Mr. Swinney is leading it. And the problem is, if they come second to Labour in this election, and if one assumes, and it normally always happens, that a new Prime Minister has a honeymoon period, and I think the honeymoon period for Keir Starmer would be short, but if there is a honeymoon period, that will give some kind of bounce for Scottish Labour, and therefore we can fast forward 6 months in the run-up to Christmas, and it's not impossible to see a scenario where the SNP comes second in the election to Labour, where Labour get a boost because of the election of a Labour government at Westminster, and all of a sudden the Scottish Government start to panic, or SNP MPs at Holyrood start to panic, and they then start asking themselves the question, well, things ain't all that good. Should we now entertain the prospect of changing leader in the run-up to 2026? And therefore, the difference between first and second is a huge one in terms of the way in which MSPs will actually look at a lot of this, and the way in which the broader independence movement will react to all of this. And of course, that's what we're here to talk about today. Our guest tonight can drill deep into the history of the national movement of Scotland. One-time MSP, former investigative journalist, broadcaster, someone when she used to write her column, the byline was rattling the cages. Dorothy-Grace Elder has been rattling the cages on behalf of the dispossessed and the marginalised for many years. Dorothy-Grace, welcome. It's great to see you.
And it's great to see you too. And thank you for such a nice welcome, Bernard.
Not at all. Now, what have you made of it all?
What have I made of the election so far? I mean, it's just so beige, the whole thing, isn't it? Everybody's frightened to say anything. You know, frightened to say, do you want a cup of tea in case that is out of order? I do not remember a more beige election. I don't know about you guys, but really. Also, I get very angry over people using this term all the time, regularly, including, God forgive them, some journalists, that we are going to restore confidence in politics. Now, can any of you name me a time when there was confidence in politics? Right back to Socrates and all these guys, originally in Athens, nobody trusted politics. You might as well say the entire population is insane, that they live in some la-la land with the unicorns creeping about. Please don't use the term restore trust in politics. No trust is a good protection for the public.
But then, if that's your general impression of the campaign, I would suggest you're underwhelmed, and I suspect you're not the only person to feel like that, given the choices available at this campaign. But what have you made, perhaps more specifically, of the SNP campaign and John Swinney's performance so far, particularly perhaps with regard to the defining question that animates the SNP, that justifies its existence, which is, of course, the constitutional issue?
Yes. Of course, we can see how he's backing down on that. And I do remember suffering through being in his group when he was leader the first time round. And I don't think he will change in any way whatsoever. He is very much a Sturgeonista. And at that time, way back, we're talking 20 years ago, he was so obedient to Sturgeon on everything. And I remember writing recently, it was like seeing a woodpecker, pecking away at a tree stump. Her every morning she'd be into his office, nebbing at him. And he did what she wanted. And he still will do, because the traces of Sturgeon are still all over the party, unfortunately, because there are other good people coming up if they get a chance. But this downplaying of independence, or sort of excuse my dust, we're really independent, but we don't want to say so too loudly. That's nonsense. Independence is an honourable cause in any part of the world. And history always sees those who were for their country's independence, for better, for worse, history always sees them with a bit of respect. There's nothing wrong with actual independence and thinking seriously about it. What has been wrong for years now, for at least 10 years, very noticeably, is the leadership within the party, not the cause, and not the great mass of the yes people who've done extremely well, but it's the leadership. I think you need Dynorod in to that front bench, because most of them are still the old hands, not all of them. There are some promising people there. Dynorod could do a good job. They could do perhaps an even better job on the deputies, the deputy ministers. Now, I don't know if any of you have to deal with some of them sometime, but it is not a life-enriching experience, to put it mildly.
Are you suggesting that a leader of the SNP who talks about Devo Max, as John Swinney did in his interview with Nick Robinson on the BBC earlier last week, is not an SNP leader well positioned to lead the people to national liberation and the glorious promised land that lies on the far side of that mountain range?
Yes, quite. That's just one of his things. It's not so much as Devo Max mentions, although that to be dropped into an election is not a good time with the actual party membership, of which I am no longer a member, but was for many, many years. But it's John Swinney's whole attitude, his failure still to answer questions directly. Now, do we really expect the miracle of any politician to be too direct nowadays? But it's getting even near directness. He slides and he slithers. He is not answering. He is exactly the same John Swinney that I remember. And the sort of tag of experience and that old newspaper line, Honest John, it's all just nonsense. He is very much an acolyte of whoever sat on them last.
Dorothy-Grace, please tell us what you think. Don't hold back. That's the great thing about podcasts. Now, we do want to talk about the future of the national question and the future of the independence movement, because, in a sense, the anchors of the independence movement were built by people like yourself, like Winnie Ewing, like George Leslie, like Isabel Lindsay, like Margot MacDonald. And I would suggest that quite a lot of people who sit as parliamentary representatives in both parliaments at the moment might not know, if I threw names at them like Jerry Fisher or Kenneth Fee or Colin Bell, who these people would necessarily be. But they are important because on the shoulders of these people, they currently stand, and in some respects, they currently owe a living. But before we get to that, I can't let you go without at least sort of putting the point to you that John Swinney, in terms of his relationship with the party, he was national secretary when he was 23 years of age. He knows the party inside out. The public persona, partly given through what journalists write, is that he is indeed Honest John, that he is a safe pair of hands, that he's a good guy. Why do you dispute that?
I dispute it because of what I saw during his own reign as leader. The bullying got completely out of hand after Salmon left, to be fair to Salmon. It was just a rumpus. It was down to playground level, pretty low life. It was nothing intellectual. It was Jeannie didn't like Teeny, so she took advantage of doing anything she could to pull Teeny's pigtails.
Well, give us an example. I mean, it's an unambiguous charge that there was sort of bullying going on in his watch when he was leader first time around. Give us an example of what it was like within the group at that time.
They could get away with anything. John ran when people went to point out something or complain. They'd normally find John had disappeared. I mean, he's a man who worked long hours, but nevertheless, he would disappear when it was necessary on one of the many, many problems that were raging behind the scenes. Margot MacDonald and I shared a room. And we also had Alec Neil in the room, so you can imagine that was quite a good room.
So a loyalist haven.
But we were loyalists to the actual cause and the party, and that's a problem. That is the tragedy when you see something being undermined daily. And with Margot and I, she warned me first. She said, "Watch out if you get a letter marked private and confidential. It will be in the papers already." And that was what you found when you arrived in the office, private and confidential. And there'd be some invented thing from the whip's office, which had already been leaked before you got it in your hand, just as damage. Now, I hadn't caused them any harm because I'd been in the unionist media for all these years, and it was not easy for a nationalist at that time. In fact, I'd written against the unionism for years, as people knew. But I won a good swing in Glasgow in the East End. And on that election night, I remember saying, "Oh, God, they'll go for me now, Labour." I said, no, Labour will not be bothered. Other side, watch your back hen from now on, And that was it. They had to have somebody else as a possible next first through past the post win in Glasgow, they thought. So they did that in other areas as well. It became awful. Sturgeon never spoke to you if she didn't like you, even when we shared an office. I mean, these things you can brush off because, God knows, I've been through Fleet Street, I've been through the BBC and so on, but I've never seen anything like it. And why not? Because television, people had to get a programme out. Newspapers, you had to get a newspaper out. So you could not have this playground stuff going on. You just couldn't have it. And that was what let rip under Swinney. It was at its very worst under him. Salmon had some control, and you could always speak to Salmon. Knock on the door and he would answer. Not Swinney. Swinney would work second-hand through the whips. And I remember a time when I had managed to get a motion into the European Parliament, and they were going to hear it was a very bad health pollution case in Glasgow, in the East End, everything dumped there. And I was also fighting a pain campaign for chronic pain patients through the health committee. Been on it 3 years. Suddenly I'm told, to see the whip. Oh, Dorothy-Grace. John and Nicola have decided that there's too many Glasgow members on the health committee. So, sorry, you're out. What do you mean? I have to go to Europe soon and I have the backing of the health committee and I should still be on it? Oh, what do you mean? There's to be no discussion. I mean, some of these people had seen too many old war films, Colditz and so on. No discussion? Where's Swinney? Where is he? We go to his door. It's locked, of course. Where's Sturgeon? She's the health spokesperson. Why doesn't she speak to people? Well, for God's sake. So, you're stuck there. What do you do about your campaigns? There was only one way out. Resign from the SNP to remain on that health committee. Isn't that sad?
Of course, Dorothy-Grace, you resigned, but Alex, question.
No, on you go, Badard. After you.
I mean, you resigned, but of course, you can resign from a party, but you still very much believe in the cause. And at 2014, there was a great deal of energy around the Yes movement. And for many people, who had campaigned for this in the dark days. And you referred to yourself, and quite rightly, it wasn't easy for people to stand up and be counted as a nationalist in the days when Labour ruled the roost in Scotland. And of course, many years later, some Labour people would say it's not easy being Labour when the SNP are ruling the roost. But given the energy of the Yes movement, given that it turbocharged the SNP all the way to over 120,000 individual members, the foot soldiers of nationalism who were there after the 2014 referendum, that it's come to this, where it almost can't get a look in an election. How does it make you feel?
Oh, awful, absolutely awful. And for other people, teachers and social workers who couldn't get a promotion in some of the old Labour days, it was heartbreaking. They were out in the wilderness because they were known to be SNP. And to see that now with all these good new people coming in, this great upsurge in 2015, when, of course, the SNP won the most record number of seats ever, I can hardly describe what it's like to those who've been through this, and to so many that we remember and who've died. I mean, you mentioned Jerry Fisher. There's just so many that I remember with great fondness, who'd worked for 50, 60 years.
What went wrong? What went wrong after the referendum?
Sturgeon, I'm afraid, and her acolytes. That was set to be the wrong course. And because, of course, Nicola was never good at speaking to people, reasoning with people, talking to them as ordinary people, other parties, that, I think, is the basic reason why she brought in the Greens and dumped the SNP with the Greens, which the majority of members did not want. The Greens are fine if they're left to do their own thing. But then we got into this awful turmoil where we're no longer fighting poverty, we're bothering about pronouns while people were in desperate need throughout Scotland. That sort of craziness stems from personalities.
Dorothy-Grace, you talk about Nicola Sturgeon's very, tight circle of people around the closed shop that she ran. I think, most political observers would say there's a significant amount of truth in all of that. But let me put something else to you that, I voted no in 2014. There's a little world exclusive for Ponsonby and Massey there. But I would put it to you that the nationalist movement as a whole has spent the last 10 years talking to itself, telling itself fairy tales, convincing itself that one more heave will do it, and has spent almost no time interrogating the question of why did people vote no? Why voting in Scotland in 2014 vote no, and what do we do to address their concerns? As somebody who voted no, I would say that the SNP has only once or twice, and then for about 2 or 3 minutes at a time, devoted any attention to people who voted no, has never ever really spent any time talking to people who voted no, and has preferred to exist in its own sort of little echo chamber, which after a while becomes exhausting and renders you increasingly irrelevant to the people who aren't already inside that chamber.
I can't disagree with that, Alex. But I think
that's unfortunate. That's unfortunate because it'd be quite good if you did.
No, because to go back to basics, the way that you gain votes from no or from anywhere or from the people who don't turn up is to work very well in the constituencies, so that no one has a particularly bad word to say for whoever their SNP, MSP or MP is. And there's others who say, oh yes, that man or that woman made such a difference to my life. They took up my case. I remember in the very early days of 99, when we were first in that parliament, saying to our group meeting, look, let's do an add up of what everybody's doing, what campaigns they're doing locally, how they're responding to people locally, because those we've got to go for are the totally unconverted, the no people, is to be in future. And convince them by damned hard work. Do that over the years, and you're beginning to have a real chance. It's not just speaking to the people, it's being with them, it's having big constituency surgeries going, answering mail. Really, there are some MPs and MSPs who are extremely good at that from all parties, and there's a hell of a lot who aren't good at it. Put them first. They are your employers when it gets down to basics. They are the people who are going to put you out of a job or keep you in a job. So basically, simple, Alex. Get together, work extremely well in the constituencies, show them by example that the party is worth voting for. They may say, oh, I don't like this independent stuff very much, but that MSP has been good for me and good for my family.
But there's a big difference, surely, between being an assiduous constituency MP and doing all of this, excellent and valuable, important casework and so on, and then persuading people that this means that independence is actually the best future for Scotland. These strike me as being two completely different questions. And it seems to be, again, that, the SNP, for instance, has had 10 years to come up with a workable and plausible answer on the currency question. It's had at least 8 years to come up with a workable and plausible answer on the border question and trade. It has had years and years and years to come up with an answer on some of the fiscal challenges that all sane observers accept arrive with independence. And it has singularly failed to do any of that hard work. The intellectual work within the nationalist movement strikes me as embarrassing in terms of its inadequacy. A truly impoverished way of thinking, and of thinking that, well, if we just avoid these very, sensible, coherent, concrete questions and problems, they will magically disappear. But they won't, and they haven't.
The currency question, that has not been answered, is quite unforgivable. That there haven't been 2 or 3 various plans. Also, that they seem to have, and so do the other parties, completely ignore the Bank of England problem, which is coming down the line in the tunnel already, and is not a light at the end of the tunnel. You know about the quantitative easing, printing money stuff that's left over from 2008, when they printed billions and billions to bail out the country. Well, the charge is £10 billion a year. And there's a report coming out from the International Monetary Fund very, very soon, somehow being held back over the election, about how the Bank of England must be repaid and can't be in this uncertain situation for more and more years. That is going to hit Labour when they're in, full in the face, but it's going to affect Scotland and elsewhere. And I'm astonished that Scotland hasn't shown up the threat that represents, and the fact that the government in Westminster has not paid attention to the vast pile of mounting debt in paying it off, and that we're now, wham, new government, wham, terrible new problem. Not new, just unsolved.
Dorothy-Grace, rather than get into the sort of nitty-gritty of what might dominate a second referendum, if it ever comes, about currency and all of these issues, there is, of course, the overwhelming strategic question of how you actually get to that second referendum. Now, you've indicated that the problem, is, as you saw it, was that Nicola Sturgeon simply had no plan in terms of what the next step was after the first referendum. Now, if one looks at what John Swinney has said, he said in that Panorama interview with Nick Robinson last week that he'll take it as a mandate to negotiate for a second referendum if he gets the largest number of seats. If he doesn't get the largest number of seats, by implication, he's conceding that the independence question is stone dead. It may well be stone dead for John Swinney. It won't be stone dead for Dorothy-Grace Elder. It will not be stone dead for the wider Yes movement, who will simply say, we demand that you go beyond the narrow confines of winning elections and mandates to negotiate governments. Would you be persuaded at all that what there is a need for on the yes side of the constitutional debate is a sense of insurgency, a sense of saying with this, we will not put up. Would you be persuaded, for example, to back Alapa?
I don't want to join any party. I've had enough of the party, but at the same time, I do have a lot of respect for what Salmond is trying to do. I'm not holding any candle for him, but he was an achiever. He did achieve that fourth bridge, if you could put it that way, and did it under budget. He achieved the free university fees, which is now contentious, of course, but nevertheless, free prescriptions, and a lot of other things. Achievement, achievement, achievement. Very, very little since. So the question that they're now playing football with is about if we win the majority of seats, that's a mandate. Come on, they won the biggest number of seats possible in 2015, and they're now down to about 43, but that is still very creditable and is obviously a majority, vast majority in Scotland. So why on earth did they not declare independence then, back in 2015, or even in 2019? Nobody had the balls to do it, to go ahead on that basis. So why would they do it now when they're standing to lose seats?
But why on earth should anyone else accept this this unilateral declaration of lunatic independence? I mean, you've set the precedent of it being done by a referendum. That then becomes, which you then say is the gold standard, internationally recognised, etc., etc., etc. All this sort of UDI stuff is pure fantasy, isn't it?
Oh, come on. That's a 1960s argument, Alex. It really, really is. I've heard that all my life. And I'm not saying that I'm standing as some great flag-waving person at the present moment, because I have so many doubts about the people who are in charge of what was once a very good and useful party. But really, we can't get back to that. Are we too small? Are we too weak? Are we too stupid to run ourselves? Well, the answer is no, if the right people are running it. The right people have not been running it for the last 10 years. You've had egotists, you've had numpties promoted beyond the levels of numpty ambition even.
No, but I accept, for instance, that there's a democratic argument that Brexit creates a material change in circumstances, etc., etc., etc. But the main reason why there isn't, it seems to me, I put this to you anyway, there isn't significant support. There's certainly nothing like majority support for another independence referendum or reopening the constitutional question in the short to medium term. Is that at a certain level, if you have a referendum of this sort on a major question where the answer is yes or no, that result has to mean something. And one of the reasons why Scottish politics is so bitterly divided over the last 10 years has been that the SNP and the Yes movement more broadly has acted as though the referendum result does not, cannot, should not, never should have any actual meaning. And so for a lot of people on the other side of the question, that's a profoundly offensive and undemocratic, anti-democratic position to take. And it's something that very few SNP supporters, very few Yes supporters seem capable of grasping. But it's something that's deeply held, deeply felt by an awful lot of people in this country.
Yeah, you feel that they are being second-rated, as if they don't count if they're not in the movement. Is that what you're saying overall, Alex?
No, well, I mean, there's obviously a bit of that in terms of the SNP's, customary pose that, supporters of independence are a better class of Scot than people who don't support independence. But no, it's a more fundamental democratic thing that if you have a referendum of this sort, the result has to mean something. And the SNP and the Yes movement has never truly actually accepted the result in 2014. And so that's why I suggest to you that there are an awful lot of people in this country who find that, anti-democratic and, yes, actually profoundly offensive.
No, but when a result is quite close, as that one was, of course people don't accept it. And for 300 years, there have been people who are part of what you would call a nationalist movement. And that's not going to end, I don't think, even now, because people want fair play, Alex. I mean, you know what Westminster's like. They've had 300 years of deception and tricks, and some of them have been decent people. Of course they have. But overall, people normally want to leave home and set up their own establishment. My terrible fear is the people who are running it. Great idea, really, but look at who's running it. That's the fear.
Dorothy-Grace, just to play devil's advocate with my comrade Massey, of course, he has a point in saying that if you have a constitutional referendum and the people speak, and if you're a nationalist, you believe in the sovereignty of the people, do you expect the sovereignty of the result in 2014? That is an entirely legitimate point to make. It is an equally legitimate counterpoint to make about whether or not the current constitutional arrangements, as they do, allow Westminster to have a veto in perpetuity over every single election result in Scotland, because you could have 2015 replicated in 2017, 2019, 24, for every election, forever and a day, because the constitutional arrangements as they exist under the Scotland Act effectively imprison the Scottish Parliament to Westminster's will when it comes to the issue of the holding of a second referendum. And therefore, let me put this point to you. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with these points of view. My point is to analyse. I'm merely giving the counterpoint to Comrade Massey's point. Would the SNP simply be better placed in attempting to say, rather than have a second referendum, let us make the debate in Scotland about the right to choose? Because there might be some people out there who say, I think we should have the right to choose, but if I exercise my choice, I choose to vote no, because I don't think it's a good idea. But I think as a matter of democracy, we should have the right to choose in the first place. Wouldn't they be better framing the debate in those terms?
Yes, I think that is a very good point, Bernard. But I think before you go ahead with that, you've got to have built up enough public respect for the work that you're doing and for your policies. You've got to get rid of some of the absolutely daft stuff and some of the people who obviously can't run anything. Couldn't piss up in a brewery, as they say. They literally could not. You've got to get rid of that and to regain confidence of the people. I'm not saying trust, but at least confidence that you seem reasonable people to be dealing with. Then have your debate on, of course, it's not fair to deny people. On another move where the Scottish Secretary dived in recently, I mean, a lot of people were quite glad because the plan was potty and something had to stop it. Unfortunately, it was the Scottish Secretary, but there had to be
This is the Section 35 use over the Scottish Government's gender recognition reforms justified on the basis that these would have spillover consequences elsewhere in the United Kingdom, affecting the implementation of the Equality Act in particular.
And we're not doing any good to gay people, to women, or indeed to trans people. And yes, I have close friends who are trans, and I know that they were not the sort of people who were going about shouting hatred and horror at other people. So occasionally an intervention from somebody, well, unfortunately, was the Scottish Secretary, but of course, because we're no longer in Europe, we've nobody else to turn to. And that pulling us out of Europe against our will was perhaps the worst example of not having any real freedom as a country, when Scotland did not vote for Brexit. And that has been very costly. And I'm surprised that the SNP isn't going harder on dragging up once again the losses it caused through Brexit. All the lost opportunities for students, for example.
Dorothy-Grace, your mention of piss-ups and breweries has reminded me that there are several good bottles of red vying for my attention. So on that point, I'm going to say thank you very much for joining us. Let's do lunch and a nice gin and tonic sometime soon. Absolutely. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Dorothy. Thank you very much, Dorothy-Grace. Lovely to hear from you. And we'd love to hear from listeners too. And so you can get in touch with us at ponsonbymassey@gmail.com or on Twitter, or X as it's now called. Our handle there is also at ponsonbymassey. We'd love to hear your thoughts, your questions, your observations, your suggestions for what we might cover in shows in the near to medium term future. But for now, from Bernard, from myself, and from Dorothy-Grace Elder, thank you very much.
Thank you. Both guys, Bernard and Alex.